All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the final installment of the Met Opera's HD Live in Schools Opera Book Club for the 2022-2023 year. We made it finally. My name is Nick Rinehart, and I'm the content manager for education at the Met Opera. And we are so excited to welcome Michael Cristofer and to be joined by students and teachers from HD Live in Schools partner districts across the country. So, Michael, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we turn to Champion and Man in the Ring, I want to emphasize again how lucky we are to have Michael with us today. He is joining us from Atlanta, where he's doing pre-production on a new film project that he's told me a little bit about. I won't spoil any details, but there are people in it that you're going to want to see. Michael was awarded a Pulitzer Prize and a Tony Award for the Broadway production of his play, The Shadow Box. His most recent play, Man in the Ring, which students across the country have been reading in preparation to see Champion this weekend, was based on the original libretto for Terence Blanchard's Champion and was awarded the American Theater Critics Award, the Chicago Jeff Award, and Boston's Elliot Norton Award for Best Play of the Year. His film work, just in brief, includes screenplays for The Shadow Box, directed by Paul Newman, Falling in Love with Meryl Streep and Robert De Niro, The Witches of Eastwick with Jack Nicholson, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Casanova with Heath Ledger. And his directing credits include Gia with Angelina Jolie, Original Sin with Antonio Banderas, and The Night Clerk with Ana de Armas and Helen Hunt. As an actor, he has appeared on stage in the acclaimed Broadway revival of A View from the Bridge alongside Liev Schreiber and Scarlett Johansson. Most recently, for those of you who are into TV, he appeared in the television series Mr. Robot as Philip Price, the head of Evil Corp. So we've been doing this book club all year, and we've talked about a couple of operas. The first was The Hours, based on Michael Cunningham's novel. We did Verdi's Falstaff, which is based on Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Windsor.
Right.
And so when we talk about the libretto, we're often talking about an adaptation from a previous source, usually a play or a novel or something else. In this case, with Man in the Ring, we're talking about a play that is kind of an adaptation of a libretto, which seems almost backwards. And so this is sort of surprising, and it's unique for us, at least in this book club context. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how it works to adapt from a libretto rather than into a libretto.
Well, it didn't quite happen that way.
Okay, great. So correct the record.
So here's the thing. Terence Blanchard, who wrote the music, he did the score for two of the films that I directed. One was Gia, and the other was Original Sin. And he was commissioned by Opera Theater St. Louis to write an opera, which was a completely unusual experience for him. And so he called me and said, would you be interested in writing the libretto for this opera? And I had never written a libretto. So, and it's always good to be frightened into doing something you don't know how to do. And so I said, yes, of course. And we decided it was about Emile Griffith. But here's the thing, never having written a libretto, I pretty much wrote 120 pages of what I thought was going to be the libretto. Well, a libretto is more like...
That seems far too long.
Yes. A libretto is more like 40 pages.
Right.
And I quickly realized that and adapted what I had done, all that material that I had. I sort of adapted it into a viable size and shape for Terence to write the music. And it worked really well. We finally got it to open in St. Louis, and then it went to several other places. And then someone phoned me, someone I knew from years and years ago, from the Court Theater in Chicago, and they said, would you be interested in telling this story of Emil Griffith as a play? And I said, well, yes, because I have about 100 pages of material that I didn't get to use in the libretto. And so that's how it happened. So I don't know quite, it wasn't quite going from it sort of went from a play to a libretto and then back to a play. Back to a play. That's kind of how it happened. And so we worked on the play, and I did it in Chicago, and then we did it in Boston, and it was very successful in both places. And there was a producer, a New York producer, who was going to move it into New York, and then the pandemic hit, and it all went away and hasn't come back yet, but I'm hoping it will.
Interesting. So Man in the Ring could come to New York after Champion's been in New York.
Yes, right.
Interesting. Just, Emil Griffith, the Palooza. So it's really interesting that you say you had this large draft that was then sort of cut down into the libretto, then expanded back into a play. And this production of Champion, is it not a revised version of the Champion that was premiered in St. Louis in 2013?
Yes, exactly. Because I think in St. Louis we had, a chorus of 10 people and 3 dancers and a dozen musicians and the cast. And when we were asked to go to the Met with it, the Met has a chorus of about 40 people. They have about 27 dancers, and geographically they have a stage the size of a small football field.
Right.
So, yes, and it was not daunting, because the director, Jim Robinson, and Terence both had just done his second opera,
right,
at the Met, so they were somewhat experienced with it, and what we did was we filled in places where we hadn't been able to go previously, we hadn't been able to explore, and Terence was very interested in, having X amount of singers more, and to enhance the music, but also it allowed the scenes to fill out a little more. There was more time. There were sort of problems that had to be solved, and in solving the problems, we kind of felt, oh gosh, it's an opportunity to expand on certain things. So some scenes that were much shorter became much bigger, and it was really a good experience. I mean, what started as a problem became an opportunity.
And I wonder, when you're, expanding the second version of Champion and filling out these details or these roles or scenes that you couldn't in the first, how much are you taking from Man in the Ring, if anything?
Exactly.
In other words, were you already prepared to expand because you had this bigger version of it, both as the play and the initial libretto that was too long?
Yeah.
Like, how much of that material made it back into Champion?
Yeah, it was not only that I had the material, but also that some of that material had been tested in the play, and I could see, oh, that's a good thing too. It's good to know a little more about Emil's son, not Emil's son, but Benny Perret's son,
yes,
whom Emil visits at the end of. It's good to know a little more about him in the opera than we did before. It's good to know a little more about Benny Perret's wife and her position, and it's good to know. It's good to be able to see a kind of contrasting thing going on between the press that's pursuing the Emil Griffith as a champion, and then Benny Perret as a champion. So yeah, there were things in the play that had not been in the opera that did go back into the opera for the Met. Yeah, yeah.
This is why we keep this for all the students out there. This is why we keep drafts and early versions of things, multiple Word documents, because that anything you take out might come back in at a later point.
Uh,
But one thing I'm wondering about the relationship between Man in the Ring and the new Champion, which I'll just use as a shorthand for the Met production, is that Man in the Ring, and if I correct me if I'm wrong, the first Champion were both structured as sort of these 10 scenes. Um, Whereas Champion at the Met is much more of a conventional sort of two-act structure. And I was wondering what goes into that restructuring of having sort of a series of scenes versus having these two bigger acts.
well, St. Louis was in 2 acts as
Okay.
well, but you're right. My initial idea was that it would be 10 rounds of a fight,
Right.
and so it would be 10 scenes. Um, and sometimes you have an idea like that and it really pays off and it really feels right.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is it didn't. And I think one of the reasons was because Terence had not written an opera before.
Mm-hmm.
Between my structure of 10 episodes and his lack of experience in terms of how do I say this? It was a new form for him, and he in the beginning he tended to write as I had sort of outlined episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, and what was kind of lacking in that was something musically that connected the first episode to the second, to the third, to the fourth.
Right.
So when we went back to it, and actually some of this happened when we went from St. Louis, it went to San Francisco and a couple other places, and then it went to the Kennedy Center.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim did some work on it at the Kennedy Center, and it became more interesting to all of us that this was a story, a man slipping into dementia, and as he's slipping into dementia, he is remembering or seeing in his demented state scenes from his past.
Right.
So it just gave us a lot more freedom and didn't sort of constrict us to be 10 episodes, 10 rounds of a fight. It got more fluid, and it allowed Terence's music to become more fluid and less episodic as well,
Mm-hmm.
which I think has all been a good thing. So sometimes you'd start with something that it's very helpful getting you going and getting an outline for a thing, or thinking, oh, this is a concept and it's going to be wonderful. And then sometimes the concept gets in the way and you just have to let go of it.
Yeah, it's good to have a structure or a kind of scaffolding just to get started, and then
Yeah.
sometimes the work itself sort of outgrows that
Yeah,
structure, but
exactly.
it's still useful as a mechanism for getting something on the page or on the stage. Um, it also sort of occurs to me after watching Champion and this sort of flashback structure that it has, where it starts with old Emil dealing with dementia and sort of rewinds to his upbringing and his, coming to New York for the first time, that this is maybe a very cinematic way of telling. I don't know. I think of a lot of biopics that I like. I think of Ray, for example, about Ray Charles.
Mm.
And a lot of them are told in flashback. And so I wonder, do you think this comes from your work in film, or am I imagining things?
Probably. Yeah, probably. But also I have never thought of it. I don't think of it as flashbacks. I
Okay.
actually think of it as things, episodes he's seeing
Hmm. Okay.
on that day.
So they're actually present.
Yeah, for him, I
Hmm.
think, and that's why he's in them, as well as we
Right.
don't just we don't just flash back and see, oh, here's the young Emile. We see old Emile looking at young Emile, interacting with young Emile together in the thing. So it's meant to be more of a trip through his demented presence,
Yeah.
as
That
opposed to a flashback.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because as students will see this weekend when it's in theaters, older Emile is sort of positioned not above the stage, but sort of above the action that happens below him, almost like watching it from above.
Yeah.
So there is this sense that it's not that he's sort of looking down upon these scenes as they're happening.
But
Just sort of
he also walks into those scenes.
right,
He's
right,
actually in them, some of them. So yeah,
right. Yeah.
yeah,
So that's very clarifying that it's not just a flashback, but they're happening in present time as older Emile is experiencing these sort of visions of his life.
yeah. In fact, I guess it's one of the things I felt, I still feel should I've had this continuing sort of,
Mhm.
I'll call it just an argument with Jim, the director, in that I feel that it looks too much like it is a flashback, and
Mhm.
I wish it looked more like a vision and in his dementia. But sometimes the material just does what it's going to do, no matter what your hopes are for it. It just organically is what it is, and it works really well. So I can't really complain.
Yeah. Plus, if there's a future production of Champions, somebody might stage it in a way that is more like a vision or you know, like what
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
envisioning rather than what is at the Met, which is one interpretation of the opera, right?
exactly.
Um, so, given that you've worked extensively in theater, film, TV, and this is your first libretto, and I like that you said you were afraid to do it, so you decided to do it. I think that's a great
Yeah.
mo. Uh, how is writing a libretto or writing for opera distinct from or similar to writing a stage play or a screenplay? I mean, what is unique about this kind of form, and what can you actually draw from writing for those other media?
Well, I'll tell you two things. Number one,
Sure.
um, my grandfather, who was a Italian immigrant, um, living in a sort of Italian ghetto neighborhood in New Jersey, he had a radio, which was one of those from 1950 or something, the size of a small Volkswagen,
Right.
in his living room. And every Saturday he would sit me down and we listened to the Met Opera radio broadcasts.
Wow.
And so I persisted, and I actually went to one production at the old Met, on 39th Street,
Mhm.
when I was 12 years old or 13 years old. And then when I was
Do you
making,
remember? Do you remember what production?
I do indeed, and
Uh-huh.
sort of coincidentally, it was Leontine Price,
Okay.
and it was Aida.
Wow.
And it's just curious that she was an African American artist, and here I am with Terrence at the moment. But anyway, all to say that the musicality of drama has always, always, always been a part of me. And when I started as an actor, I actually did musicals. I worked in musicals, and I guess I could sing well enough. I don't think of myself as a singer, but I could sing well enough. So the thing is, when you write a libretto, you're not, and I learned it rather quickly.
Mhm.
You're not writing a play. You are basically writing lyrics
Right.
to music. So it's so different. It's so completely different. But fortunately, there was a part of me that I think always wanted to do that. And I think because of because I've been going to the Met or listening to the Met or going to the Met for 70 years. Something rubbed off, something got into my psyche, and yeah, that's the difference. When you're writing a libretto, it's not writing. You create the story, unless it's an adaptation, of course, but you do create the story as a writer. But what is being sung, it's not dialogue. It's lyrics. These are lyrics, continuing lyrics to a continuing song, and that's very different. I mean, I did a lot of lyrics that rhymed. Some of them don't. Some of them
Mhm.
do. There's a kind of poetic impulse in the work when you're doing a libretto, and there's also a kind of incredible economy that you have to learn, because the music is going to do so much, so much. Um, so those are the big differences, I think.
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot as we've been talking about librettos in general. It's just, opera, especially at the Met, opera is thought of as such a large scaled operation, which it is. But the libretto is actually a very small thing. And there's this sort of weird relationship between, I mean, libretto literally means small book, right? So, a libretto is a scaled down thing, almost the length of a long poem versus a play or
Yeah,
something. But the time it takes to get through the libretto can be 3 to 4 hours. So it's this weird sort of relationship between something that's very small and something that's very grand,
yeah.
um, that I just find very difficult to sort of make sense of. Um,
And it depends too on how people work,
mhm,
Um, I think because Terence really, well, he's his own kind of musician in terms of performing, but in terms of writing scores for movies,
mhm,
what generally happens in that case is the director makes a movie, and then they give the movie completed to the composer, and so the composer is working on something that's already done. Um, so in this relationship with Terence, um, I pretty much wrote. First, I did an outline, which just told the story, and then I
mhm.
went back and I started to write the lyrics and to try to create the poetry of what would be sung. Um, and then he took that and he took it away. And honestly, I didn't. It was about 7 or 8 months before we were back together again.
Interesting. So it was kind of the same process as film scoring in the sense that you delivered him the parcel, and then he sort of built the musical language around the libretto,
Exactly.
rather
Yeah.
than the two of you sitting at a table going bar by bar.
And that might not be true for every
Mhm,
librettist or composer. I mean,
mhm,
it just depends. But I think that's the natural way for Terence to work, and yeah, and so you try to in the libretto to tell the story, but also to inspire something in the music.
mhm.
And
So yeah, I'm very interested in the fact that you grew up listening to the Met Opera broadcasts,
yeah,
and I'm just wondering if you have a favorite opera or favorite operas that you've seen, um, just to as an opera fan and for our young opera lovers, what is your go-to in terms of opera?
well, I'm I'm in my blood Italian, and so I
We'll
can't
forgive you for that.
I can't help it. I can't help but really, Verdi to me is just about everything. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's mostly Verdi. I will say the third act of La Boheme is pretty amazing. Um, the I do. I have spent a lot of time with Tannhäuser, the
Okay,
Wagner.
the Wagner. Yep.
Yeah, certain. But truly, when it comes back, I mean, and it's Verdi is just pretty much papa, but just sublime, and some of the worst stories ever told. I mean, talk about libretti.
Hmm.
You know, I guess it's Trovatore, where the woman throws the wrong baby into the fire. You know, you just think, well, I guess
What,
you have to have the
whatever works.
whatever works.
But our students, the opera they saw right before, well, they haven't seen Champion yet, but the last screening was Falstaff by Verdi.
Ah,
So we have the contemporary, but we also have the
yeah.
canon. So one final question I want to ask you before we go is, now that you've done a libretto, you've checked that off your list. Which of any of your works, either for film or for stage, do you think would make a good opera, and why,
Ha. What a
if
good
any?
question. Yeah. Well, because I'm saddled with it as, I guess the Shadow Box would make a pretty good opera, really.
I think so.
It would be, it wouldn't be grand. I mean, it wouldn't have, I don't know that you'd have a chorus, um, but it's certainly 9 or 10 interesting characters, and because the way the story is told, you would have music that brought the different stories together, and
Right.
might be good.
Yeah, it reminds me, just sort of structurally speaking, of The Hours, and the fact that it had, these three scenes that are
Yeah,
taking place, at different
well, that's
places and
right.
different times, but three sort of box-like constructions on set that all sort of are next to each other, in relationship with each other, and that might be a good kind of
Yeah,
template for doing a kind of shadow box opera.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'd like to write another original one. I
And
really.
is there an idea? Can we
No, I don't.
can we workshop something?
Yeah, yeah. No, I had a great idea, but it's been done. I didn't realize it had been done, and I'd love to hear it or see it. But I thought it would be fantastic to do I think it was the 1996 disastrous climb up Mount Everest, um, which it's just an amazing story. I worked on a screenplay for it that never got made. Um, but the individual stories, and then I thought something about the stage of trying to put that mountain on the stage
On a stage?
might be interesting.
So it's already been done as an opera.
Yeah, apparently someone, I read about it somewhere in San Francisco, I think.
Okay.
uh, there was a and I think it was a mixed media thing, or it was sort of, I don't know. I haven't been able to find out about it, but I thought, oh wow, somebody's actually done that. Which,
Interesting.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
if it's not, if the story isn't copyrighted, maybe it's worth
Yes,
worth a second attempt.
yeah,
Uh, but that's really interesting. How do you get Mount Everest on a stage? That's something the Met could do, but uh,
yes. I was thinking of, the sort of like the Philip Glass operas, and
mhm,
that there would be an abstraction of the mountain on the
mhm.
stage, and all these people in their different stories were so extraordinary. Anyway,
Yeah, different groups of different people all meeting in the same place and having this
yeah,
shared journey together.
yeah,
Um, that's sort of the outline of one of the operas we're doing next season, Florencia and el Amazonas by Daniel Catan, which is a bunch of characters on a steamship going down the Amazon River. So it doesn't
ah,
have the same, geographical implications, but it's the same kind of idea of what
yeah,
happens when you put all these different people in one space and time together.
yeah,
Um, so
exactly.
if anybody out there wants to write the Everest opera, I approve.
Yes, call me.
So thank you so much for joining us, Michael. On behalf of our HC Live in School students and educators, we can't wait to see Champion in just 2 days on April 29th.
Yeah,
And it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you so much.
pleasure's mine. And I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing. And I'm so happy you're all going to see the opera. I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks.